Thanksgiving was supposed to be the one night of the year when I felt safe walking back into my parents' house. A long table, warm food, familiar faces at least, that was the illusion. What I didn't expect was my father standing up in front of everyone, his voice sharp enough to cut through the room, and saying, "You're a useless failure." The words landed harder than the silence that followed. My mother stared at her plate. My sister hid a smile behind her wine glass. Then my dad pointed at the door and yelled, "If you can't get your life together, go live in the streets." I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I smiled. Because while they were convinced I had destroyed my future, they had no idea I earned $27 million a year. They didn't know that every insult, every judgment at that table, was based on a story they'd invented about me. So I picked up my coat, wished them a happy Thanksgiving, and walked out. 3 weeks later, the truth walked back in without me. Thanksgiving at my parents' house always followed the same script. The door opened to the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon. The living room already filled with voices that sounded warm on the surface but sharp underneath. Hugs were exchanged, compliments rehearsed, and everything looked perfect if you didn't listen too closely. I arrived alone, as usual. No partner, no dramatic announcement, just me and a bottle of wine I knew my mother would politely criticize later. "You didn't have to bring the cheap one?" she said with a tight smile, setting it aside like an afterthought. "It's from a small vineyard," I replied calmly. "I like it." She hummed, unconvinced, already scanning the driveway as if expecting someone more impressive to walk in behind me. The dining table was crowded with relatives I barely saw the rest of the year. Laughter bounced around the room, but it wasn't the kind that reached your eyes. It was performative Thanksgiving laughter. My father, Robert, sat at the head of the table like a judge presiding over a courtroom, napkin folded perfectly, posture stiff, already irritated before anyone had said a word. And then there was my sister, Emily. Emily arrived late, of course. She always did. The room shifted the moment she walked in, dressed impeccably, confidence polished and ready to be admired. "There she is," my father said proudly. "Working late again?" Emily smiled. "Someone has to pay the bills," she joked, her eyes flicking toward me for just a second too long. Dinner began with harmless questions that weren't harmless at all. "So, Harper," my aunt asked, leaning forward, "are you still doing that thing online?" "That thing. Not my company. Not my work. Just that thing." "Yes," I said evenly. "I'm still doing it." My father chuckled, shaking his head. "I don't know how you live without a real job. No stability, no structure." My mother nodded. "We just worry about you. You're not getting any younger." Emily sipped her wine and added softly, "It's not too late to start over, you know. Some people just need more time to figure things out." I smiled and took a bite of turkey that suddenly tasted like cardboard. I'd learned years ago that defending myself only made it worse. The more I explained, the more they heard excuses. So I stopped explaining. They talked over me as if I weren't there about Emily's promotions, her busy schedule, her responsibilities. My father beamed like her success was proof that he'd done everything right as a parent. And every compliment she received felt like a quiet indictment of me. At one point, my mother leaned across the table and whispered, not quietly enough, "You know, if you ever need help getting back on your feet." I met her eyes. "I'm fine." She sighed. "That's what worries us." The irony almost made me laugh. I looked around that table, at the people who shared my last name but had never really seen me. They thought they knew my life because they'd decided who I was years ago, a disappointment, a cautionary tale, the child who didn't follow the rules. They had no idea how carefully I'd built my world, how deliberately I'd kept it separate from theirs. And as dessert was being served, I felt the tension tightening, the impatience in my father's jaw, the way Emily's smile sharpened with every passing minute. This wasn't just dinner. It was a verdict waiting to be announced. I didn't know exactly when my father would explode. I only knew it was coming. Dessert had barely touched the table when my father finally snapped. It wasn't dramatic at first. No shouting. Just that tight, dangerous calm in his voice, the kind that meant he'd already made up his mind. He set his fork down carefully, wiped his mouth, and looked straight at me. "So," he said, "what exactly are you doing with your life, Harper?" The room went quiet. Every conversation around the table faded into an awkward hush. I felt all eyes turn toward me, waiting, some curious, some smug, some already convinced they knew the answer. "I'm working," I said. "I've told you that." My father let out a short, humorless laugh. "That's not an answer. You're 32 years old. No degree, no career anyone can explain, no future plan we can see." He leaned back in his chair. "How long do you expect us to pretend this is normal?" My mother shifted uncomfortably. "Robert, maybe this isn't the time." "No," he cut in sharply. "This is exactly the time. We keep dancing around it every year and nothing changes." Emily tilted her head, feigning concern. "Dad's just worried about you, Harper. We all are." I looked at her. "Funny. It doesn't feel like worry." Her smile thinned, but she didn't respond. My father's voice grew louder. "You've been coasting for years, living in that apartment, doing your little projects, acting like you're independent when everyone knows you're barely getting by." I felt my chest tighten. "I've never asked you for money. Not once." "That's not the point," he snapped. "The point is you're a failure who refuses to admit it." The word hit me harder than I expected. Failure. He said it so easily, like it had been sitting on his tongue for years. My mother finally spoke, her tone cool and controlled. "We've tried to help you, Harper. But you don't listen. You don't take advice. You don't respect the values we raised you with." "What values?" I asked quietly. "Judging people by appearances?" That did it. My father stood up so abruptly his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Enough." He pointed toward the front door. "If you're so determined to live like this, then do it somewhere else." No one moved. No one defended me. "Go live in the streets," he yelled. "Maybe then you'll finally learn how the real world works." The silence afterward was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, slow and steady, almost detached. Emily stared into her glass. My mother folded her napkin like this was just another uncomfortable moment to clean up later. I waited for something, an apology, a pause, even a hint of doubt. It never came. So I stood up. "I hope you all enjoy the rest of Thanksgiving," I said calmly, my voice steadier than I felt. "Truly," my father scoffed. "Don't be dramatic." I picked up my coat and met his eyes. "This isn't drama. This is your choice." As I walked toward the door, I didn't feel angry. I felt clear, like something had finally been said out loud that could never be taken back. They thought they'd just taught me a lesson. What they didn't know was that this moment, this public rejection, this humiliation was the last piece they needed to hand me something far more powerful than their approval, and I walked out before they could say another word. The cold air outside hit my face the moment the door shut behind me. It was late November, the kind of cold that seeps through your coat and settles into your bones, but I barely noticed it. I stood on the porch for a second longer than necessary, listening. No footsteps followed me. No one called my name. Inside, Thanksgiving continued without me. I walked to my car slowly, my movements deliberate, as if I were afraid that if I rushed, everything I was holding together would spill out. When I sat behind the wheel, I rested my forehead against it for a moment, not because I was crying, but because I needed to breathe. I checked my phone. Nothing. No message from my mother asking if I was okay. No text from Emily pretending to smooth things over. Not even an angry follow-up from my father. It was as if the second I stepped outside, I stopped existing. I drove away from the house I grew up in, the windows glowing warmly behind me, and felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not heartbreak, not rage, detachment. The first week after Thanksgiving passed in a strange quiet. I went back to my routine early mornings, meetings, flights booked at the last minute, numbers and contracts that demanded precision. My life moved forward exactly as it always had. Efficient, controlled. My family apparently assumed it had collapsed. I started hearing about it through other people. Casual comments slipped into conversations. A vague tone of pity. "I heard you're going through a rough patch," a distant cousin said on the phone. Another asked carefully, "Are you managing okay?" That was when Jacob called. "You good?" he asked, skipping any pretense. "I'm fine," I said. He hesitated. "Your parents are telling people you left because you couldn't handle the truth. That you're struggling." I closed my eyes and leaned back in my chair, staring up at the ceiling of my apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows, City lights stretching endlessly below me, a space they had never seen and never been invited into. What exactly are they saying? I asked. That you don't really have work. That you're embarrassed. That you'll come back once reality hits. I almost laughed. They weren't just rewriting what happened at Thanksgiving. They were rewriting me, turning my silence into evidence of failure, my absence into proof that they'd been right all along. For a brief moment, I considered correcting the story, sending a message, making one phone call that would shut everything down. But then I realized something. They wanted a reaction. They wanted me defensive, desperate, small, so I gave them nothing. No calls, no explanations, no attempts to clear my name. Instead, I let them talk, because every false story they told, every smug assumption they made, was quietly building toward something they didn't see coming. And the more comfortable they felt with their version of me, the harder the truth would hit when it finally arrived. They thought they'd thrown me out into nothing. What they didn't realize was that I was standing firmly in a life they had never been allowed to enter, and I had all the time in the world to decide how and when to let the truth speak for itself. By the second week after Thanksgiving, the silence broke, but not in the way I expected. My mother was the first to reach out. Her name lit up my phone in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, right between two calls with my legal team. I watched it ring for a moment before answering, already knowing the tone she would use. "Harper," she said brightly, as if nothing had happened. "I was just thinking about you." I almost smiled. "I'm sure," I replied. There was a pause, brief but telling. Then she continued, her voice slipping into that familiar blend of sweetness and authority. "Your father and I are reorganizing the house. There's some heavy furniture that needs moving this weekend. I thought you might have time since, well, you're not exactly tied down." Not an apology, not concern, an assumption. "I'm busy," I said calmly. "With what?" she asked, the question light, dismissive. "Work." She laughed softly. "Of course, that little online thing." Then, lowering her voice, she added, "You know, Harper, family is important. One day you may need us. It's not wise to burn bridges." I felt something shift inside me, not anger, but clarity. "You already burned it," I said. "I just stopped standing in the smoke." She exhaled sharply. "You're being dramatic." "No," I replied. "I'm being honest." I ended the call before she could respond. Later that evening, Emily made her move. She didn't call. She never did when she wanted to feel superior. Instead, she posted a photo on social media, a perfectly staged dinner, candlelight, a caption about gratitude and resilience, and buried in the comments, a reply to a mutual acquaintance who asked how I was doing. "Harper's just going through a phase. Some people take longer to grow up." Jacob sent me a screenshot with a single line underneath. "I thought you should see this." I stared at the words longer than I should have, not because they hurt, but because they confirmed something I'd been avoiding. They didn't just want me gone. They wanted me diminished. As long as I stayed quiet, they could control the narrative. They could keep me frozen in the role they'd assigned. The failure, the warning, the example of what not to become. And in their minds, that gave them power. That night, I made my decision. Not to confront them, not yet, but to protect myself completely. The next morning, I sat down with my attorney and my financial advisor. We went through everything: accounts, assets, access points I'd never bothered to close because I hadn't thought I needed to, joint remnants from years ago, old permissions, weak links. "We lock it all down," I said. "Everything. No more assumptions, no more openings." I also authorized a quiet review, nothing aggressive, nothing illegal, just facts, public records, financial patterns, information I was entitled to know, not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted leverage if they crossed another line. And then I stepped back again. No messages, no corrections, no explanations. I let them believe what they wanted. Because people who think they're in control tend to get careless. They talk too much. They push too far. And I had learned something important about my family over the years. When they thought I was weak, they felt safe. And that safety, their smug certainty, their careless arrogance, was going to cost them far more than they realized. 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, my father called me. Not to apologize. Not to ask how I was doing. To demand an explanation. Harper, he said sharply the moment I answered, skipping any pretense of warmth. Why am I hearing your name from people who have no business talking about you? I leaned back in my chair, the city spread out beneath my office windows, sunlight glinting off glass towers my parents didn't even know I worked in. That depends, I said calmly. What are they saying? He hesitated just long enough to tell me he was rattled. They're saying you're some kind of executive, he snapped. That you're involved in companies making real money. Don't insult my intelligence. If that were true, we'd know. That was the moment I realized how deeply they believed their version of me. Not hopeful, not curious, certain. I never lied to you, I said. You just never listened. My mother's voice suddenly cut in on speaker. Harper, please. If this is some kind of misunderstanding, we can talk it through. You don't need to embarrass the family. Embarrass them. I smiled. I'm not embarrassing anyone, I replied. I've been invited to speak at a public event tomorrow night. You might want to watch. Silence. What event? Emily asked sharply, her voice tight for the first time since Thanksgiving. You'll see, I said, and ended the call. The next evening, the room was full. Investors, executives, journalists. A clean, professional space where my name was printed clearly on the program. Harper Williams, founder and managing partner. I walked onto the stage to polite applause that grew warmer as I began to speak about growth, about resilience, about building something quietly while being underestimated. I didn't mention my family. I didn't need to, because the truth was doing the work for me. The next morning, my phone exploded. My mother called first, then my father, then Emily 3 times in a row. When I finally answered, my father's voice was unrecognizable. Not loud, not commanding, thin. Why didn't you tell us? He demanded. I tried, I said evenly. You laughed. My mother jumped in, her tone trembling now. Harper, you have to understand how this looks. People are asking questions. They're saying things. Yes, I replied. They're saying the truth. Emily finally spoke, her voice sharp with panic. Do you know how humiliating this is for us? Everyone thought. Thought I was nothing? I cut in. You made sure of that. They started talking over each other then. Explanations, justifications, rewriting history in real time. We were just worried. We pushed you because we cared. You should have told us. I let them talk until they ran out of breath. Then I said, quietly, you didn't lose me 3 weeks ago. You lost me at that table. When you told me to go live in the streets and watched me walk out, my father tried to regain control. This doesn't change the fact that we're your family. It changes everything, I replied. Because now, the power dynamic had shifted. They weren't judging me anymore. They were afraid of what I represented, afraid of what I might say, afraid of what people would connect, afraid of how small their certainty suddenly looked under the light of facts, contracts, and public truth. I hadn't raised my voice once. I hadn't insulted them. I hadn't needed to. All I did was exist openly, visibly, undeniably. And as the calls kept coming, as their control crumbled into frantic damage control, I realized something that surprised even me. Walking out of that Thanksgiving dinner hadn't been the moment I lost my family. It had been the moment I finally stepped out of the story they wrote for me and into one they could no longer edit, silence, or take away. And this time, I wasn't smiling to survive. I was smiling because they finally understood. I was never the failure. The days after everything came out were quieter but not peaceful. My family stopped calling all at once, as if they'd agreed silence was safer than saying the wrong thing. But I could feel the fallout spreading anyway, moving through the same social circles they'd once used to elevate themselves. Jacob kept me updated, careful and factual, never dramatic. Your dad hasn't been to his club all week, he told me one afternoon. People are asking questions. A lot of questions. I wasn't surprised. My parents had always cared deeply about appearances. They thrived on being seen as respectable, successful, in control. And now, the narrative they'd built for years had cracked. Not because I attacked them, but because the truth didn't match the version of me they'd been selling. Emily took it the hardest. Her confidence, which had once felt untouchable, started to fray. Invitations slowed. Conversations grew awkward. People who had once nodded along when she talked about her struggling sister now looked at her differently, curious, skeptical, sometimes openly judgmental. It turns out, humiliating someone only works when the lie holds. My mother tried again a few days later. This time, the message was short. We need to talk. Privately. I didn't respond right away. I read it, set my phone down, and went back to work. Meetings, contracts, decisions that affected hundreds of employees, people who depended on me to stay steady and clear-headed. That was my priority now. When I finally replied, it was simple. I'm open to a conversation. With boundaries. She didn't like that. You're being cold, she said when we eventually spoke. This isn't how family treats each other. I almost laughed. Almost. This is exactly how family treats each other, I said calmly. You just don't like being on this side of it. There was a long pause. Then her voice softened, carefully chosen. We didn't realize how much we hurt you. That's the problem, I replied. You didn't try to. I wasn't interested in apologies shaped by consequences. I didn't need tears now that the audience had changed. What I needed and what I was finally allowing myself to claim was distance. So I made it official. No more unannounced calls. No more public commentary about my life. No more access to my time, my work, or my decisions. Everything went through clear, respectful channels, or not at all. My father didn't respond well to that. He sent one message, curt and bitter. You think you're better than us now. I read it once and deleted it. Because the truth was, I didn't think I was better than them. I just refused to be smaller anymore. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for their approval, their understanding, or their permission to move forward. The space they left behind wasn't empty, it was freeing. Thanksgiving had taken something from me. But in return, it had given me something far more powerful. Clarity. And clarity, I was learning, changes everything. The final call came late on a Sunday evening. I knew it was coming before my phone even rang. There was a pattern to these things. When control finally slips, people reach for whatever thread they think still connects them. This time, it was my mother. Harper, she said softly, as if lowering her voice might undo everything that had already happened. We can't keep going like this. I stood by the window of my apartment, watching the city glow beneath me. This is exactly how it needs to go, I replied. She inhaled sharply. Your father is struggling. Emily is upset. People are talking. We're still a family. There it was. The word they always used when they wanted something. Being family, I said carefully, doesn't mean I accept being diminished. That's not what we meant, she insisted. We were trying to motivate you, to protect you. I closed my eyes for a moment. You protected your image. Not me. She didn't deny it. Instead, her voice wavered. What do you want from us? It was the first honest question she'd asked me in years. I want accountability, I said. Not excuses, not rewrites. I want you to acknowledge what you did, what you said, without turning it into a lesson or a justification. Silence stretched between us. I don't know if your father can do that, she finally admitted. I know, I replied. That's why things are different now. She tried once more, her tone almost pleading. Can't we just start over? I shook my head, even though she couldn't see it. You don't start over without finishing the truth. When the call ended, I didn't feel relief or sadness. I felt settled, like a door closing gently instead of slamming shut. Later that night, Emily sent a message. Just one line. I never thought you'd actually leave. I stared at it for a long time before responding. I didn't leave. I typed back. I stopped waiting. She never replied. That was when it truly ended, not with shouting or revenge, but with understanding. The kind that doesn't ask for permission and doesn't need agreement. I had said everything I needed to say. And for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to explain myself to anyone at all. The call came a few days later, late enough that I knew it wasn't casual. It was my father this time. I almost didn't answer. Part of me wondered if this was another attempt to regain control, another speech dressed up as concern. But I picked up anyway, if only to hear how he would frame it now. Harper, he said, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. Not gentle, just stripped of authority. We need to talk. I'm listening, I replied. He cleared his throat. This has gone far enough. You made your point. People know you're successful. There's no need to keep punishing us. Punishing. The word settled heavily between us. I'm not punishing anyone, I said slowly. I'm protecting myself. You embarrass this family, he snapped, the old edge slipping back in. Do you have any idea what people are saying about us? Yes, I said. For once, they're not lying. There, it was the truth he still couldn't face. He wasn't upset because I'd been hurt. He was upset because the version of me he'd controlled no longer existed. We raised you, he said sharply. You owe us respect. I felt a familiar pressure in my chest, but it didn't overwhelm me this time. It passed. Respect isn't something you can demand after telling your daughter to go live in the streets, I replied. You don't get to erase that just because the outcome didn't go your way. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, more softly, so what now? That question mattered. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a threat. This, I said. Distance. Boundaries. No more public commentary about my life. No more assumptions about what I owe you. And if we don't agree? I didn't hesitate. Then nothing changes. He exhaled slowly. You've changed? No, I said gently. I've grown. When the call ended, I sat there longer than I expected to, letting the silence settle. It didn't feel empty. It felt earned. Later that night, my mother sent a message, not an apology, not a defense, just a simple sentence. I didn't realize how strong you were. I read it once and set my phone down. Strength wasn't something I needed them to recognize anymore. Because strength, I'd learned, isn't about winning arguments or proving your worth. It's about knowing when to stop explaining yourself to people who only hear what benefits them. That Thanksgiving, they thought throwing me out would break me. What it actually did was free me to finally decide who gets to stay in my life and who doesn't. And this time, that decision was mine alone. A month after Thanksgiving, I found myself standing in my kitchen late at night, city lights stretching endlessly beyond the windows. The chaos had settled by then, the calls had stopped, the rumors had cooled, life had returned to its steady rhythm. And for the first time, I noticed how quiet it felt inside me. Not lonely, not empty, peaceful. I thought back to that night, the table, the plates of food, my father's voice cutting through the room, the door closing behind me. For years I'd believed that moment would destroy me, that being rejected by my own family would leave a permanent fracture. Instead, it clarified everything. I realized I hadn't lost a home that night. I'd lost an illusion, the belief that love had to come with judgment, that belonging required shrinking myself, that silence was the price of acceptance. Walking away didn't make me cold, it made me honest. I stopped chasing approval that was always conditional. I stopped carrying guilt that was never mine. And I stopped explaining my life to people who only listened when it confirmed what they already believed. What I built my career, my independence, my sense of self, was never about proving them wrong. It was about proving to myself that I could survive without their validation. And I did. Thanksgiving comes around every year. The table looks different now. Smaller, quieter, filled only with people who don't ask me to be less than I am. If there's one thing I learned, it's this. Being told to go live in the streets didn't end my story. It began the moment I realized I never needed their permission to stand on my own, and that more than money, more than success was the freedom that finally felt like home.